Welcome to Noetic. I'm CJ, and I'm joined by Jordan, who's going to lead us in the
Part 9 of Book 10
of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So I'll let Jordan take it away.
Cool. So today we we're doing something a little bit different, and we're gonna have some fun stuff going on today. We're gonna have some magic. We're gonna talk about pirates today, and the one passage, because at this point, and CJ, I'm sure you'll agree with me, Marcus Aurelius is starting to get a little bit repetitive. So the two things that I've noticed in this book that were a little bit different was Marcus Aurelius' discussion of the physical world and his mention of slavery. So today, since slavery in the ancient world is one of my favorite research subjects, I thought, today might be a fun day to talk more about that.
Great.
So the passage that I wanted to draw our attention to is chapter 25, and I'll read the passage. One who flees from his master is a runaway slave. Now the law is our master, and one who departs from it is therefore a runaway slave, and likewise one who, yielding to grief, anger, or fear, wishes that something had not come about, or were not coming about, or should not come about, of what has been ordained by the power which governs all things. For that too is law, assigning to each of us what is due to him, and one who yields to fear or distress or anger is therefore a runaway slave.
So then I think I'll read my translation, and mine is Penguin Classics, and I think the translator is Martin Hammond. And what was yours?
My edition is Oxford University Press, and the translator is Robin Hard.
Cool. So this is Martin Hammond from the Penguin Classics version. So chapter 25. A slave running from his master is a fugitive. Law is our master. The lawbreaker is therefore a fugitive. But also in the same way, pain, anger, or fear denote refusal of some past, present, or future order from the governor of all things. And this is law, which legislates his lot for each of us. To feel fear, then, pain, or anger is to be a fugitive. Or fugitive, yeah.
Ooh. Yeah, I like that. So what I thought was really interesting was there's a really great lecture that I found of all places on YouTube, and I'm gonna botch the pronunciation of his surname. I apologize in advance, but Dr. Michael Sucre, and so he has this really great lecture on Marcus Aurelius, and he points out that the two most prominent Roman Stoics of this time were Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. And I thought that it was absolutely fascinating that he tells us, and I mean, it's, pretty much fact, that Marcus Aurelius is an emperor and Epictetus was a slave. And he points to this irony that one man is an emperor and has literally the world at his fingertips, and Epictetus was a slave, but both men can participate in this equalizer that's philosophy, and both men are still sort of subject to these laws of the universe.
So would you then say that one use of Stoicism is to, I suppose, bring you up from whatever condition you are? So maybe you're a slave and you try to rise above those conditions, and maybe the other, being an emperor, Stoicism in a sense can lower you down or bring you back down. It can ground you in some way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely definitely the right mindset to have towards that, because with Marcus Aurelius, I mean, he was a man who had the power of life and death over every single subject in his empire. And Epictetus, by definition as a slave, had absolutely no sort of sanctity to his own body. His body was not his own as a slave in the most sort of real and technical sense. So we have sort of this leveling effect basically with philosophy, where we have the mind and reason is what asserts your will and your personhood, regardless of your legal status or sort of like your lot in life. Which is the beauty of Stoicism, because it's if you act morally and sort of correctly, then that's what it means to be a good person. It's not contingent on your legal status. It's not contingent on how much money you have. It's if you act well. And you don't need money to act every day.
But there's this idea that we're all slaves somehow, or at least in that passage it implies that we're all a slave somehow to something. I can't remember, but I'm curious how that extends to what you're saying, or will extend to what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we'll kind of probe the text a little bit more. In chapter 19, Marcus Aurelius points out the sort of, the pettiness of and how ridiculous people are. And he just says, and yet, but a short time before, how many masters were they, so the petty people, slaving for? And with what ends in this view? And in no time at all, they will be reduced to a similar state. So I think that he's saying that the sort of, what's the point of sort of being a court suck-up? What's the point of constantly trying to improve your condition no matter what it is? Because we're always going to either be slaves or masters in some regard, and it happens all so quickly. Then what's the point of stressing out about it? So
then, how does that extend to the slavery thing? So I guess he says, no matter how much you fight against it, you're going to be a slave to your own things that happen to you in some respect, and that you have to go with that. And if you try to be a fugitive or break the law and try to run away, then that's not what you want to do, I suppose, in some respect.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of this is that no matter pretty much like what position you're in, you can try to sort of wiggle your way out of sort of on this earth of being a slave and to become a master. But you're always going to have to sort of bow in submission to the sort of the greater powers and like the powers that be. So
let's go into that idea of the powers that be, or at least this idea of slavery, and framing it into the context of what we're discussing here, especially Stoicism, and maybe a little bit of this chapter or book in general.
Yeah. So I guess a few things that I want to mention about slavery in the ancient world is the cool thing is that it wasn't predicated on race. So the whole point, or I guess the main points of slavery was the fact that you were alienated from your homeland, you were isolated from your own kin groups, and you were violently subjugated. And Orlando Patterson did a wonderful study on this in his book called Slavery and Social Death. And he calls the institution of slavery, quote, a permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. And then Thomas Wiedemann, who's another wonderful scholar, emphasizes that the Romans in particular were very legally minded and sought to sort of codify the dependency and disenfranchisement of slaves. So slaves legally, they had no rights. They had absolutely no identity, and they didn't even have control over things like their own name. So pretty much every point and every sort of aspect in that regard is just controlled by a master.
Okay.
So it's this idea that you are living in a world where you feel very alienated, you feel very foreign, and you have absolutely no control over the events that take place in your life. And I thought of this one passage, and it's chapter 28 with meditations, and it reminded me. So I guess what I'd like to sort of preface this is with Marcus Aurelius being in the imperial period, this idea of enslavement and this sort of paradoxical concept of being ultimately free by submitting to the greater powers of the universe was a very prevalent theme throughout Roman thought. So not just philosophy, but even in literature. And in chapter 28, he points to the futility of basically of resisting so much. So he says, look on anyone who is pained or discontented at anything that comes to pass as being like a little pig kicking and squealing at sacrifice. And so he's saying that essentially we're like the animals getting dragged to the altar for the sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And if what's going to happen to us is going to happen anyway, then why resist so much?
That's something that we've touched upon so many times, and I think he does too, is this idea that one day or 2 days, it doesn't necessarily matter, and that in some sense we try to prolongate our death or try to resist it. And he gives us this great analogy that you just mentioned, and that you have to just go with it, or you can't. If you resist it, it doesn't really do you any good.
Yeah, and it reminded me, and then so when I read that passage and I kind of thought about, animals resisting and sort of kicking and kind of like screaming, or in this case, which I'm about to mention, braying, of The Golden Ass by Apuleius. And the main character is this sort of like insatiable curiosity. He's a voyeur. He goes to Thessaly because he wants to learn about magic, and he sees this woman whom he's staying with as a guest transform herself into a bird, and he's like fascinated. So he just sort of like rubs himself in this potion, and he turns himself into an ass. And he's basically taken away before he can eat the antidote, which is a rosebud. Mm-hmm. And so as pretty much as an ass, he basically just endures every single humiliation and beating possible. He like narrowly escapes death several times and the like. And then it gets to a point where he just breaks down because he realizes there's absolutely no way I can escape this. This is just what I'm absolutely consigned to. Mm-hmm. And so in the final book, he's actually almost forced to have sex with a human woman. So he tiptoes out of the situation and he just like runs away. And he collapses on this beach from sheer exhaustion. And once he wakes up, he sees that the moon is out. And he begins to pray to her because he says, "For I knew that the moon was the primal goddess of supreme sway and that all human beings are the creatures of her providence. Considering this, therefore, and feeling fate was now satiated and with my endless miseries, and at last licensed a hope of salvation, I determined to implore the august image of the risen goddess." So he prays to her with just like these just like absolute tears of supplication. And he rinses himself off in the ocean and purifies himself. And Isis comes to him in this vision, and she says, "Behold, I'm come to you in your calamity. I am come with solace and aid. Away with the tears. Cease to moan. Send sorrow packing. Soon through my providence shall the sun of your salvation arise. Hearken therefore with care unto what I bid." So by fully submitting himself to the supremacy of Isis, she grants him the ability to become human again.
So it's almost in a way that she's telling him to not wish for things, just to take what she gives him. And in this acceptance, he is to be given providence or given salvation in some way.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. That's it.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Marcus Aurelius says on 35 or chapter 35, where he talks about the symptom of quote unquote disease, and how that is in some respect somebody wanting the good things in life and those alone. I guess he uses the idea of of demanding pale colors. I want to look fine, I want to have straight teeth, and how these things are merely just ideas that you can change things and that you can try to control them in some way, but in most respects you can't. I mean, I'll quote him just so I can stop babbling here. The healthy eye must look at all there is to be seen and not say, I only want pale colors. This is a symptom of disease. The mind which says, my children must live, or there must be popular acclaim for all I do, is the eye demanding pale or the teeth demanding pap. So in this respect, that, and I'll quote him again, and so the healthy mind too must be ready for all eventualities, that you have to be ready for these things. You have to be like the golden ass and just take it all and take what Isis gives you, and in taking that in some way that is its own reward. That if you're just wishing to be not an ass, then that, I suppose, is not the healthy mind. That is quote unquote disease in Marcus Aurelius's eyes.
Yeah, and I think that disease is that erroneous assumption that we can control everything. What we can control are we can control our reason, we can control our response to things, but ultimately it's the sort of divine machinations of providence that ultimately determine what happens in your life. And I thought, so sort of going along with the sort of paradoxical idea of freedom and enslavement, there's this really great story from the epistles of the Cynics, and one of the members, Crates, is writing a letter to Metrocles, and he's telling the story about Diogenes and how he and some other people get kidnapped by pirates. And allegedly Diogenes, he handles the situation really well. Everyone's panicking. While they're on board, they're not feeding the captives. And, Diogenes is able to stay calm and says, hey, since you're selling us for our bodies, what looks way more attractive for a slave buyer? A healthy slave. So you should feed us. So he's able to get them fed and everything like that. And then once they get into port, then they're about to get broken up in the slave market, and they all start crying. And Diogenes chastises all of his friends and says, won't you stop feigning ignorance and crying over your imminent slavery as if you were really free before you fell into the hands of pirates and were not slaves to even worse masters? For perhaps you will be allotted moderate masters who will cut you out of the luxury by which you were ruined, and who will instill in you perseverance and self-control. Which I thought was, so that ties into this idea that morally, kind of what Marcus Aurelius was saying in chapter 25, that in some way or another, we are all slaves.
Yeah, and that we have to accept it, or not so much accept it, but it's almost this idea of amor fati, or love fate. You have to love it in some regards, and that, I don't know, it almost seems like you're describing being on a roller coaster, and life is being on a roller coaster in that regards, and if you're enjoying it, then you are fulfilling your life in some regards. We talk so much about how it is, how you take things in your life and how you control yourself. Or that seems to be a lot of what Marcus Aurelius talks about, but we haven't really talked about just accepting things.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that you're bringing that up, because that's something he touches on again and again, and maybe it might seem to contradict what we're talking about in regards to, you have to switch that thing around and make it better, or take your lot and change it around and do this and do that. But a lot of the times it's just accepting it, and that's a big part of it. So it's great you're bringing it up.
And I thought it was kind of interesting because in another letter, Crates is writing to a woman called Hipparchia, and he's saying, come join us with this sort of cynic lifestyle, in order that you might be freed from nature, since all are slaves either by law or through wickedness. So again, it's you don't have to necessarily be like a designated slave precisely in order to feel like you're trapped necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily just circumstance, but it can also just be your own your own desires, pretty much. And what's really interesting is that how I see the Stoic sort of mindset towards slavery, you can also see it reflected in Christianity, because Peter in letter 2:11 says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Live as free men, yet without using your freedom as a pretext for evil." And he says to live as douloi, and douloi is, that's plural for the Greek word for slaves, the slaves of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor.
So there's this acceptance and subservience to, God in that respect, but I suppose you see it even going back to Stoicism, or, if we want to say Marcus Aurelius as well, where you just have to be subservient to what your lot is, and then in doing that is, I don't know if you could say morally right, and the wrong thing is to try to be that fugitive slave that runs away.
Right, because I think that if we can think of it in terms of, because I wanted to bring this segment in from Peter because it helped me understand it better, in that if you are subservient to this role, sort of, and if you were sort of slaves to God, and interchangeably in the Stoic context, if you're sort of a slave to Providence, then you are in effect honoring the whole. And you're using your reason in order to sort of override that sort of like animalistic instinct to resist submission.
No, I think it's great you mentioned the whole, because I think Marcus Aurelius does, especially in chapter 5, where he talks about this idea that whatever happens to you, is in some way prepared for you by the whole, or by Providence, or by God, if we want to use Peter's wording. So in some sense, there is this connection to the whole, and that, it's almost as if, like, if you resist, then you're resisting your lot in this bigger scheme of things. And we've talked previously about how Marcus Aurelius the whole is very important to him. So if the more you try to go against the whole, the worse it is for everyone. So there is, in some respect, a need to adhere to it in whichever way you can, and in some ways it's just taking what you've been given and going with it. Right,
and I think that, because in my mind I almost picture getting caught under sort of two different undertows, essentially, because you are sort of struggling in this sort of like net of fate, and then you're also kind of dealing with the other currents of the universe. So you're just kind of basically just getting thrashed about. So at that point you can either kind of dig yourself out of the net and just kind of like ride the currents, or you can just continue just to persist in this sort of agony of resistance.
So then what's the difference between being a part of that net and wanting to get out? Because I think what's very fascinating about it is that we have this paradox in a way where you have to accept what's given to you, yet you have to rise above what's given to you. So what is the line that Marcus Aurelius draws between absolute defeat and then almost a dignified way of taking something, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that, I would say, probably for him, would be the function of reason. Right?
Okay, go on with that, yeah.
I mean, I would just think that if we're kind of like caught in this sort of tension, I feel like that the only way to sort of mediate like the sort of paradox would to be reason and sort of like proper action. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
No, that makes sense. And I think it's what Marcus really says in chapter 16. He just says, let's not worry about what it takes to be a good person. Just be a good person. And then maybe that's part of it. You just have to be deliberate with your action in some respect, and sometimes it might be hard to understand what that means, but it almost seems as if you accept your fate. It almost seems like you accept it and then you do good. It's not you accept it, like you said, and then you become the cattle or the little pig that is, wrestling against it, because the wrestling doesn't really help, or, trying to get away from it just makes things worse. And that could be you just, screaming at traffic, or just being angry at people. But maybe there's this thing of like, once you accept it, what's happening to you, then you can do the good work, like you said, or just be a good person, or just live with reason. And maybe that's the first step, is to admit that something happened, and then take that extra step to go along and do something good. Because maybe that's where people have trouble, is they just take something and then they don't know what to do with it, or they thrash against it. And maybe that's what Marcus Aurelius is finding about himself and other people he sees. And then that's the first step. And then the second step is just once you can get beyond that, then you can do all these things that he's mentioning, going beyond that, being a good person, looking at other people and seeing what drives them and how they function. I think that's chapter 20 or 37, where he says, ask people, or once you can get past having somebody offend you, you can see, okay, what is running their wires, or how are they, what is their function, why are they doing what they're doing?
Like what's their motive? And I think that what's interesting about this sort of paradox of freedom and enslavement, it's that initial passivity really actually opens you up to all of these sort of possibilities to take action. So sort of accepting sort of an initial passivity, it just allows a lot of activity to flourish, which I thought is just kind of super fascinating, and it's like frustrating at the same time, but it's also very intriguing and very just very fascinating. And Epictetus, because I figured, well, if we're talking about Marcus Aurelius, it only really seems fitting that if we bring in Epictetus. So I was looking through some of his stuff from Emmanuel, and he says that things in our power by nature are free, unhindered, untrammeled. Things not in our power are weak, servile, and dependent on others. Remember then that if you imagine that what is naturally slavish is free, and what is naturally in others is your own, you will be hampered, you will mourn, you will be put into confusion, and you will blame gods and men.
I got nothing, yeah.
Right, yeah. So it's like super interesting that, because he also sort of warns of the dangers, right, of sort of transgressing and getting yourself sort of misled of like what things are in your control. So certain things, I guess, would be, like your property, if you think that you own an estate, and if it gets repossessed or something like that, that's something that you think is your own, but is truly not yours in the fullest sense.
Sure, and that's something we see time and time again with Marcus Aurelius, is this sobering up. It almost seems as if part of the meditations is this hangover cure for all the power that he has in his possession, like you mentioned in the beginning, that he can just kill somebody like that and have any women or men or whoever at his beck and call. And he mentions that a lot of times. I'm trying to see if there's maybe one example in book 10 that we can find where he mentions this idea that whatever you have, praise whichever, it's not going to be there forever, and it will go.
Yeah, I would say chapter 34, he says that that all of these people that are in your life, and I think for Marcus Aurelius, there are a lot of people who are flatterers. There are people that just want things from him. He pretty much says that these sort of generations of people are like leaves, you know, and that they sort of almost blow in and they blow out, essentially.
Yeah, life is comings and goings. I think sometimes we think of that in regards to death or, you know, life and death, but it can also be the life and death of a friendship. It could be one, you know, a relationship. Perhaps even in this case, it could be about fame or any kind of acclaim that one gets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or position that you'll have it, and then it'll come, and then it'll go at the same time. And they're just leaves. You can't make one leaf more important than another. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's a really good way to put it. Yeah, it's like you can't really necessarily prioritize sort of like one person over another.
Sure, one person, one status symbol, or anything like that. And yeah, it's just that, and you have to take it all as it is, which I think is what Marcus Aurelius is saying and what you're implying.
Yeah, and I think that what's really interesting about Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius is that they're both Stoics, but they are sort of almost on opposite sides of the spectrum, because Marcus Aurelius is a man who has absolutely everything and rejects everything that he has, and whereas Epictetus virtually has nothing, you know, as a slave, and still rejects it. And I think that I wanted to sort of potentially wrap up our discussion with this one quotation, because I thought Epictetus just phrased it beautifully. There is only but one way to freedom, to despise what is not in our power.
Yeah, it makes sense. And if you're, can you say that again?
Sure. There is only but one way to freedom, to despise what is not in our power. So it's really cool to see how Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius arrive at the same conclusion, but from sort of different approaches.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah.
That was really cool.
So I think, I think that's pretty much it. Just keeping it short and sweet. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And if you like what you hear, you can download us on the App Store for Apple or Google Play for droids. And then we're on YouTube. And most importantly, well, not most importantly, but we're also on SoundCloud. And I think that's pretty much it. So, thanks everyone.
Thank y'all.
See you guys soon.